My name is Regina, and at 34 years old, I stood in my childhood home watching my parents count stacks of $100 bills on their mahogany dining table. The same parents who told me 6 months ago they couldn't afford $25,000 for my life-saving surgery were now demanding I give them $66,000 from my settlement. As my mother looked up with calculating eyes, I realized the people who gave me life had been waiting for this moment to destroy it. Before I share what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you someone who's dealt with toxic family members who only see you as a bank account? If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of survival and triumph. Trust me, what my parents did next will leave you speechless, and how I fought back might just inspire you to stand up for yourself, too. Let's dive into this unbelievable journey of betrayal, near-death experiences, and ultimately sweet justice. Growing up in our sprawling colonial house in Greenwich, Connecticut, you'd think I had everything a child could want. My parents, Dorothy and Richard, were successful real estate developers who drove matching Mercedes and vacationed in the Hamptons. But behind those pristine white walls and manicured lawns was a truth that took me decades to fully understand. I wasn't their daughter, I was their afterthought. My younger brother Blake came into this world 2 years after me, and from that moment the universe shifted in my parents' eyes. While I got hand-me-down clothes from garage sales, Blake wore designer labels. I remember my 13th birthday when I asked for a bike to ride to school. My parents bought me a rusty used one from Craigslist that broke down within a month. That same week, they surprised Blake with a top-of-the-line BMX bike he'd mentioned once in passing. The pattern was set early and never wavered. Blake received private tutors for every subject while I was told the public library had all the resources I needed. When I struggled with calculus, my mother's response was that maybe I just wasn't cut out for advanced math. When Blake failed algebra, they hired a tutor from Yale who came 3 times a week at $200 per session. I worked 3 jobs through college, stocking shelves at Target until 2 in the morning, tutoring kids on weekends and cleaning offices during summer breaks. Every penny went toward my tuition at the state university. Meanwhile, Blake's acceptance to Yale was celebrated with a party that cost more than my entire year's expenses. My parents paid his full tuition, room and board, even his fraternity dues without batting an eye. My dream of medical school died the day my parents refused to co-sign my student loans. Dorothy sat at that same mahogany dining table filing her nails as she explained they couldn't risk their credit score. This was 3 days after they'd bought Blake a new Audi for making Dean's List, which he'd achieved by paying someone to write his essays. The cruel irony came 2 years later when Blake failed out of Yale. My parents not only covered it up, telling everyone he was taking a gap year to find himself, but they paid another $100,000 to get him into a private college in Boston. No one in our family knew except me, and I was threatened with being disowned if I ever revealed the truth. Despite everything, I built my own success. I became a pharmaceutical sales representative, starting at the bottom and working my way up through sheer determination. At family gatherings, my parents took full credit for my achievements, telling relatives they'd instilled such strong work ethic in me. Dorothy would pat my hand condescendingly and say, "We taught Regina that nothing comes easy in life," while Blake sat there in his third Rolex, unemployed at 28. The first signs of my health issues started during a particularly stressful quarter. Sharp pains in my abdomen that I initially dismissed as stress. When I mentioned it at Sunday dinner, Dorothy waved it off as attention-seeking behavior. "Regina always was the dramatic one," she told Blake, who snickered through a mouthful of filet mignon. Richard just grunted and changed the subject to Blake's latest business idea, a crypto venture they were considering funding. My apartment became my sanctuary, a small one-bedroom in Stamford that I'd saved for years to afford. It was the only space where I could exist without being compared to Blake or criticized for not being grateful enough. I decorated it with plants and secondhand furniture that I'd refinished myself, each piece a small victory of independence. Dorothy's manipulation was an art form she'd perfected over 34 years. She knew exactly which buttons to push, oscillating between guilt and gaslighting with professional precision. "After all we've done for you," was her favorite refrain, usually followed by a list of basic parental obligations she'd barely fulfilled. Richard enabled her every step, controlling the family finances with an iron fist while pretending to be the reasonable one. Blake's entitlement grew with each passing year, nurtured by our parents' unlimited indulgence. He treated me with casual cruelty, making snide comments about my appearance, my job, my apartment. At family events, he'd loudly wonder why I couldn't afford nicer things, knowing full well I'd funded my entire life myself, while he'd never worked a day. The stage was set for what would become the most harrowing year of my life. Little did I know that my body was harboring a ticking time bomb, and the people who should have been my safety net were already planning to let me fall. The presentation to Hoffman Pharmaceuticals was supposed to be my big break. Regional manager position, six-figure salary, everything I'd worked toward for 7 years. I was mid-sentence explaining our new oncology drugs market penetration strategy when the pain hit like a sledgehammer to my gut. The PowerPoint remote clattered to the conference room floor as I doubled over, my vision blurring as waves of agony radiated through my abdomen. The ambulance ride to Hartford Hospital was a blur of sirens and worried paramedics asking questions I could barely process through the pain. By the time we arrived at the emergency room, I was barely conscious, my blood pressure dropping dangerously low. The ER team moved with practiced efficiency, hooking me to IVs and monitors, while shouting medical terms I recognized from my pharmaceutical training but never imagined would apply to me. Dr. Patterson, the emergency surgeon, didn't mince words after the MRI results came back. I had a massive ovarian cyst the size of a grapefruit that had twisted around itself and was cutting off blood supply to my organs. Worse, it had wrapped around vital structures and was showing signs of imminent rupture. If it burst, the internal bleeding could kill me within hours. I needed emergency surgery, and I needed it now. That's when the nightmare truly began. My new job at Rexford Pharmaceuticals had started just 2 weeks prior. The 90-day waiting period for health insurance meant I was completely uncovered. The surgery would cost $25,000 upfront, non-negotiable. As I lay in that hospital bed fighting waves of pain and nausea, I had to make the most humiliating phone call of my life. My hands shook as I dialed my parents' number, each ring echoing like a countdown to humiliation. Dorothy answered on the fourth ring, her voice already impatient. When I explained the situation, gasping through the pain, her response was a study in calculated coldness. "Regina, darling, you know we simply don't have liquid assets available. Everything is tied up in investments." I could hear the television in the background, some reality show about wealthy housewives. Richard got on the phone next, his tone dismissive as always. "You should have been more careful with your health insurance gap. This is what happens when you don't plan properly." He launched into a lecture about fiscal responsibility while I writhed in agony, the irony not lost on me that he'd just funded Blake's third failed business venture to the tune of $100,000. Through my hospital room window, I watched families coming and going, supporting their loved ones, and the isolation hit harder than the physical pain. Blake didn't even bother returning my calls. When he finally texted back, it was to say he was busy with his new startup and couldn't talk. I later learned from my cousin that the same day I was begging for my life, my parents had written Blake another check for his company's expansion. Nurse Carla became my unexpected lifeline during those terrifying hours. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands, she held mine as I sobbed not just from pain, but from the realization that my parents would rather let me die than liquidate a single investment. She didn't know me owed me nothing, yet showed more compassion in those moments than my family had in 34 years. Monica from the hospital's financial assistance department worked tirelessly making calls and filling out applications. She stayed 3 hours past her shift determined to find a solution. No one should have to choose between their life and bankruptcy, she said, her own eyes filling with tears as she watched me struggle. The surgery was postponed twice as we scrambled for options. Each delay increased the risk, and by the second day, internal bleeding had begun. Dr. Patterson warned that we were running out of time. The cyst was unstable and my body was starting to shut down from the trauma. I made desperate calls to extended family, but each conversation ended the same way. "Your parents have money," they'd say. "Why aren't they helping?" My coworker, Janet, who I'd known for less than a month, did something extraordinary. She started a GoFundMe campaign and rallied the entire sales team. Within hours, donations poured in from colleagues, many of whom I'd never even met. The local news picked up the story after Janet contacted them, running a segment titled, "Woman Nearly Dies as Wealthy Parents Refuse Payment." The news coverage was a double-edged sword. While it brought in more donations, it also exposed my parents' callousness to their entire social circle. Dorothy was furious, calling me from the country club to scream about how I'd embarrassed them. "How dare you air our private business?" she shrieked, apparently missing the irony that my potential death was less important than her reputation. The hospital's charity care committee finally approved emergency funding, but not before I'd spent 62 hours in excruciating pain, my life hanging by a thread. As they wheeled me into surgery, I wasn't thinking about the financial burden or my parents' betrayal. I was thinking about Carla holding my hand, Monica fighting for me, Janet rallying strangers to save my life. These people who barely knew me had become more family than my blood ever was. The surgery was more complicated than anticipated. The cyst had adhered to multiple organs, and what should have been a 2-hour procedure stretched to 6. I flatlined twice on the operating table, a detail Dr. Patterson only told me weeks later. When I finally woke up in recovery, disoriented and weak, the first face I saw was Carla's. She'd come in on her day off to check on me. My parents visited exactly once during my 3-week recovery. They stayed for 5 minutes, Dorothy commenting on how pale I looked, while Richard checked his phone constantly. They didn't ask about my pain, my fear, or my near-death experience. Dorothy's parting words were about how this whole situation had affected her standing at the garden club. Blake never visited at all, though he did text once to ask if I could still get him a discount on prescriptions through my job. As I lay in that hospital bed, watching the genuine concern on the faces of near strangers, while my family's absence echoed through the room, something fundamental shifted inside me. The little girl who'd spent decades trying to earn her parents' love finally died on that operating table, and the woman who survived had no more illusions about where she stood in their priorities. Returning to work after 6 weeks of recovery was both a triumph and a revelation. My supervisor had kept my position open, and my colleagues welcomed me back with genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to my family's cold indifference. The promotion I'd been presenting for when I collapsed was still mine, a regional manager position that came with a substantial raise and the bitter irony that I was now earning more than Blake had ever made in his phantom careers. The full extent of my parents' betrayal began unraveling at Thanksgiving dinner. I'd reluctantly attended, still hoping for some acknowledgement of what I'd been through. Instead, Dorothy held court at the dining table, spinning an elaborate fiction about my medical emergency. According to her version, I'd exaggerated a minor procedure into a life-threatening crisis for attention. She actually used the phrase, Regina always was prone to dramatics, while I sat there with surgical scars still healing beneath my dress. Aunt Helen. My mother's sister, who'd always been the family truth teller, pulled me aside after dinner. Over coffee in the kitchen, she revealed something that made my blood run cold. Your parents have over $3 million in liquid savings, she said quietly, watching the back door where Dorothy might appear. I saw the statements myself when I helped them with their taxes last year. They could have paid for your surgery from their checking account interest alone. The room spun as this information sank in. While I'd been dying while strangers had emptied their pockets to save me, my parents had millions sitting in accounts earning more than I made in a year. Helen's eyes were full of pity as she patted my hand. I'm sorry, honey. I thought you should know. 2 weeks later, Blake's latest business venture, a cryptocurrency trading platform that was obviously a scam, collapsed spectacularly. Not only did my parents bail him out of his $200,000 debt, but Dorothy threw him a comfort party to help him cope with the stress of failure. The same woman who couldn't find $25,000 to save my life hired a full catering service to make Blake feel better about losing other people's money. The discovery that made everything clear came through my friend Amy, who worked at a major insurance company. She called me one evening, her voice shaking. Regina, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I found something. Your parents have a life insurance policy on you, a big one. $2 million, and they're the sole beneficiaries. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. My parents had bet on my death. Christmas dinner became a confrontation. I arrived with printed copies of what I'd learned, laying them out on that mahogany dining table like evidence in a trial. Dorothy's reaction was masterful manipulation. She clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face as she wailed about how I was attacking her after everything she'd sacrificed. Richard pounded the table, threatening to write me out of the will entirely, as if I'd ever expected to see a penny. Blake, emboldened by wine and parental support, decided to twist the knife. At least now everyone can see your scars match your personality, he said, smirking. Ugly inside and out. The room went silent except for Dorothy's theatrical sobs. Not one person defended me. These people who shared my blood sat there while Blake mocked the scars I'd earned surviving what they'd tried to let kill me. My cousin Amy had been recording on her phone initially to capture what she thought would be a normal family gathering. Instead, she caught something far more sinister. Later that night, she sent me the video with shaking hands. In it, after I'd left, my parents discussed my surgery with chilling casualness. If she hadn't made such a public spectacle, the whole thing would have worked out differently, Dorothy said. Richard's response froze my blood. $2 million would have solved Blake's problems permanently. They had wanted me to die. My parents had calculated my worth at $2 million in insurance money and found it more valuable than my life. The video showed Blake laughing, actually laughing, as he said, "Well, there's always next time." They were already planning for another opportunity. I changed my locks the next day after finding Richard in my apartment when I came home from work. He claimed he was checking on me, but I found him in my home office going through my files. My laptop was open to my bank accounts, which he'd apparently been trying to access. When I demanded he leave, he sneered that ungrateful daughters who bit the hand that fed them often found themselves completely alone. The harassment escalated quickly. A private investigator started following me, sitting outside my office and home in a black sedan. I documented everything, taking photos and noting times. My parents wanted to know about the settlement from my GoFundMe, how much I'd saved, what assets I had. They were cataloging my worth like inventory. Dorothy recruited my former college friend Melissa to spy on me. Melissa called out of the blue, suddenly interested in rekindling our friendship. Something felt off, and my instincts proved right when she slipped during lunch, mentioning details about my promotion I hadn't shared. When pressed, she broke down and admitted Dorothy had offered her $5,000 to report on my finances and personal life. The attacks became professional. My boss received anonymous complaints about my performance, questioning my mental stability and suggesting I was a liability. Fortunately, he recognized the vindictive tone and traced the emails back to a dummy account Dorothy had created. Her technological ineptitude was the only thing that saved my career. Late-night phone calls started hanging up when I answered. My car tires were slashed twice. A brick through my window came with a note, "Family takes care of family." The security footage showed Blake's distinctive walk, though the police said it wasn't clear enough to prosecute. I lived in a state of constant vigilance, never knowing what would come next. Lawyer Lisa Chen, recommended by Monica from the hospital, became my guide through this nightmare. She helped me document everything, creating a paper trail that would become crucial later. "Your parents are escalating because they're desperate," she explained. "They see you thriving despite them, and it threatens their entire worldview. Be careful. Desperate people do dangerous things." Her words proved prophetic. The worst betrayal wasn't the money, the harassment, or even the death wish. It was the realization that I'd never had parents at all. I'd had owners who saw me as an investment that had failed to pay proper dividends. And now, like any dissatisfied investor, they wanted to liquidate their assets. The pharmaceutical conference in Boston represented everything I'd worked for. Regional managers from across the Northeast would gather to discuss new strategies, and I was presenting our district's exceptional numbers. I'd triple-checked my route, planned to arrive early, and even had my presentation backed up in 3 places. What I hadn't planned for was the 18-wheeler running a red light at 70 miles per hour. The impact happened at the intersection of Route 84 and Mason Street, a moment frozen in my memory like a photograph. I saw the truck barreling through the red light and had just enough time to think absurdly that at least my parents wouldn't collect their insurance money before 4 tons of metal slammed into my Honda Accord. The sound was indescribable, a symphony of crushing metal, shattering glass, and screaming tires that ended in eerie silence. Consciousness came and went like waves. I remember the firefighter's face hovering above me, her lips moving soundlessly as hydraulic tools shrieked around us. The jaws of life, I thought hazily, the tool that would give me a second chance at life my parents had tried to deny. Blood ran into my eyes, and when I tried to move, nothing responded. The firefighter held my hand, another stranger showing more compassion than family. The helicopter ride to Massachusetts General was a blur of medical jargon and barely controlled chaos. The trauma team met us on the roof, and I was rushed straight into surgery. My pelvis was shattered in 6 places, internal bleeding threatened multiple organs, and my left lung had collapsed. Dr. Morrison, the lead trauma surgeon, later told me they'd lost me twice on the table before managing to stabilize the bleeding. 2 weeks passed before I was coherent enough to understand my situation. The medical report read like a horror novel. Reconstructed pelvis held together with titanium rods and screws. Lacerated liver and spleen requiring partial removal. Traumatic brain injury causing temporary memory loss. 4 surgeries down, at least 3 more to go. The physical therapy projections suggested I might walk normally again in a year if I was lucky. My parents didn't visit for 2 weeks. When they finally appeared, it was with an agenda. Dorothy swept in wearing her charity luncheon outfit, immediately asking about insurance coverage, before even inquiring about my pain. Richard pulled out a notebook, jotting down details about the accident and potential liability. Not once did either of them touch me, hold my hand, or show any sign of genuine concern. The truck driver had been intoxicated, his blood alcohol 3 times the legal limit. Worse, Hartman Trucking had known about his drinking problem and multiple violations, but kept him on the road to meet deadlines. Their insurance company reached out within days, desperate to settle before I could fully understand the extent of my injuries. They knew they were liable for millions. Patterson and Associates. Boston's premier personal injury firm took my case immediately. James Patterson himself visited my hospital room, bringing a team of investigators who would uncover a pattern of negligence going back years. Hartman Trucking had 18 similar incidents, all covered up with quick settlements and non-disclosure agreements. My case would be different. Suddenly, my parents became model caregivers. Dorothy arrived daily with homemade soup, the first meal she'd cooked for me since elementary school. She fussed over my pillows, adjusted my blankets, and told every nurse how devoted she'd always been to her daughter. The performance was Oscar-worthy, especially when attorneys or medical staff were present. Richard transformed into the concerned father he'd never been offering to help with paperwork and medical decisions. He brought flowers and get-well cards, creating a paper trail of devotion that hadn't existed for 34 years. The man who couldn't be bothered to visit during my first surgery now maintained a daily vigil, always with legal documents conveniently nearby. Blake's appearance was the most transparently fake. He showed up with an enormous bouquet and tears that dried the moment no medical staff were watching. "Tough break, sis," he said, eyeing the medical equipment like he was calculating its resale value. "Good thing you've got family to help you through this." The words nearly choked him, but our parents had clearly coached him well. The manipulation reached new heights when Dorothy suggested I give them power of attorney for my protection, of course. When I refused, she pivoted to suggesting I move back home to recover. Richard had already prepared their guest room, she said, though in 34 years I'd never been allowed to use it. Even Blake's old room had been kept as a shrine while I'd slept on the couch during college breaks. They tried to insert themselves into every meeting with my lawyers. Dorothy claimed she needed to be there as my mother, clutching tissues and performing grief for anyone watching. When Patterson firmly excluded them, she wailed about being shut out during her daughter's time of need. The same woman who'd refused to save my life was now desperate to control its value. My parents befriended other patients' families, gathering intelligence about settlements and payouts. They pumped nurses for information about my prognosis, trying to calculate the exact worth of my injuries. I caught Richard photographing my medical charts when he thought I was sleeping, documenting evidence for their own purposes. The settlement negotiations took 4 months. Hartman Trucking's insurance offered $2 million initially, but Patterson knew we could get more. The company's history of negligence, combined with my extensive injuries and lost earning potential, pushed the number higher. Throughout it all, my parents hovered like vultures, their attention directly proportional to the settlement amount. When the check arrived, $220,000 after legal fees and medical expenses, my parents were in the room. I'll never forget Dorothy's face as she watched me sign the settlement papers. Her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing naked greed so intense it took my breath away. Richard's hand actually twitched toward the check before he caught himself. "We need to talk about family obligations," Dorothy said the moment the lawyer left. Her transformation was instantaneous, from grieving mother to debt collector. Richard pulled out a folder he'd obviously prepared in advance, and Blake blocked the hospital room door. They'd coordinated this ambush while I lay there, still unable to walk, held together by metal and stubbornness. The stage was set for their ultimate betrayal, the moment they'd apparently been planning since the day I was born. In their minds, I was never their daughter. I was an investment, and it was time to collect. 3 days after the settlement check was deposited, my parents called a family meeting at my apartment. I was still in a wheelchair, barely able to transfer myself from bed to chair without screaming in pain. They'd insisted on using their key, the one I'd foolishly given them during recovery, arriving while my home health aide Denise was there, ensuring a witness to their performance of parental concern. Dorothy entered carrying a leather portfolio, the kind she used for her real estate closings. Richard followed with a briefcase, and Blake brought up the rear, smirking like a hyena who'd spotted wounded prey. They arranged themselves around my dining table with practiced precision, a boardroom meeting where I was the hostile takeover target. Regina, darling. Dorothy began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We've given considerable thought to your future, and we've prepared something to help guide your financial decisions. She opened the portfolio with a flourish, revealing a spreadsheet that would have been comedic if it weren't so calculating. Every penny they'd supposedly spent on me from birth to age 18 was itemized in obsessive detail. The list was staggering in its pettiness. Breakfast cereal from 1992, calculated at $3 per box times 365 days times 18 years. Public school fees that were actually free, but they'd assigned a value based on local private school tuition. Birthday parties I'd never had were listed with venue costs and catering charges. Even the electricity I'd used was calculated as if my existence had been metered from birth. The total comes to $66,000, Richard announced, sliding a formal invoice across the table, an actual invoice printed on their company letterhead, billing me for being born. We've been more than patient, allowing you to establish yourself professionally before requesting repayment. However, given your recent windfall, we feel it's appropriate to settle accounts. I stared at the document, trying to process the surreal moment. My parents were billing me for childhood expenses while I sat in a wheelchair they'd refused to help purchase. The pain medication made everything feel distant and dreamlike, but this nightmare was crystal clear. They wanted me to pay them for the privilege of being neglected. We created you, Richard said, his tone shifting from businesslike to aggressive. Every opportunity you've had stems from the life we gave you. Your success is built on our foundation, and we're entitled to recoup our investment. It's simple economics, Regina. We own part of your success because we created the person who achieved it. Blake couldn't contain his excitement, practically bouncing in his seat. I get 10% too, he chimed in. For being your brother, emotional support tax. He laughed at his own joke while our parents nodded approvingly. The golden child was claiming a share of the settlement for simply existing in proximity to my pain. My voice, when I found it, was steadier than expected. You're seriously trying to charge me for being your child? You want me to pay you back for basic parenting? The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so cruel. These people who'd refused to save my life now wanted compensation for creating it. Dorothy's mask slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Ungrateful children like you never understand the sacrifices parents make. Do you know what we could have done with that money? The investments we missed. Blake could have gone to Harvard if we hadn't wasted resources on you. The revision of history was breathtaking. Blake hadn't gotten into Harvard, and they'd spent more on his failed businesses than they'd ever spent raising me. When I refused their demand, the threats began immediately. Richard pulled out another document, this one from their attorney. Connecticut has filial responsibility laws, he said, tapping the paper. Children can be held legally responsible for supporting their parents. We've consulted with Morrison and Associates, and they believe we have a strong case for parental support given your current financial situation. The letter detailed their plan to sue me for abandonment and emotional damages. They claimed I'd caused them severe distress by publicly embarrassing them during my medical crisis. The GoFundMe campaign had damaged their reputation. They argued, costing them business opportunities and social standing. They wanted compensation for their pain and suffering caused by my refusal to die quietly. My friends Sarah and Michael had come over for dinner, arriving in the middle of this ambush. They stood frozen in my doorway, witnessing the full scope of my parents' depravity. Sarah, a social worker who'd seen plenty of family dysfunction, later told me she'd never witnessed anything so coldly transactional between parent and child. "You have 1 week to transfer the funds," Dorothy announced, gathering her papers like a loan shark collecting markers. "After that, we'll be forced to pursue legal action. And Regina, dear, you know how expensive lawyers can be, especially when you're recovering from such extensive injuries. It would be a shame if the stress affected your healing." The threat was clear. They would make my recovery hell if I didn't pay. As they prepared to leave, Blake couldn't resist a final cruelty. He knocked over my water glass, watching it shatter on the floor near my wheelchair. "Oops," he said, stepping over the broken glass. "Better clean that up. Wouldn't want any more accidents." My parents said nothing, Dorothy actually smiling at his casual cruelty. After they left, my apartment felt violated. Sarah helped me to the couch while Michael cleaned up the broken glass, both of them stunned into silence. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was shaking with rage. "Those aren't parents, Regina. Those are predators, and they've just shown you exactly who they are. Believe them." The social media campaign started that night. My parents, who'd barely understood email, had hired someone to launch a coordinated attack on my character. Facebook posts appeared on extended family pages, describing me as a drug addict who'd stolen money from them. Instagram stories claimed I'd faked my injuries for sympathy and profit. They even created a website detailing my supposed crimes against family values. The extended family quickly chose sides, most defaulting to my parents' version. After all, Dorothy and Richard were successful, respectable people. Why would they lie? My grandmother's 90th birthday party became a battlefield, with relatives interrogating me about why I was destroying the family. Uncle Carl, who'd borrowed $50,000 from my parents and never repaid it, lectured me about gratitude. Church became another front in their war. My parents told their entire congregation that I was persecuting them, that they'd sacrificed everything for an ungrateful daughter who now refused to help in their time of need. The pastor, who'd received substantial donations from them over the years, gave a sermon about honoring thy father and mother that was clearly directed at me. I hired attorney David Chen on Lisa's recommendation. Within days, he'd uncovered a pattern of behavior that shocked even him. My parents had a history of financial exploitation dating back decades. Uncle Thomas revealed they'd pulled the same stunt on him 20 years ago when he'd received an inheritance. He'd paid them $30,000 for raising him before realizing the insanity of their demand. 3 other relatives came forward with similar stories. Cousin Janet had been billed for Christmas presents after getting a promotion. Nephew Marcus was invoiced for family vacations he'd attended as a child after his business succeeded. My parents were serial emotional extortionists, creating a paper trail of family members who'd either paid up or been excommunicated. David's investigation revealed something even darker. My parents had been claiming me as a dependent on their taxes for years after I'd moved out and become self-sufficient. The fraud totaled hundreds of thousands in illegal deductions. They'd also taken out credit cards in my name during college, running up debts I'd never known about. My credit report was a disaster zone of their making. As the week deadline approached, my parents escalated their harassment. Blake was caught on my building's security camera attempting to break into my apartment at 3 in the morning. He was so drunk he couldn't work the lockpick properly, spending 20 minutes fumbling before security arrived. The restraining order I filed the next day sent Dorothy into a theatrical rage that required her own trip to the emergency room. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd faked a heart attack for sympathy, running up a bill she expected me to pay while I'd nearly died twice from lack of family support. The hospital staff, recognizing her from my previous stay, treated her performance with professional skepticism. One nurse whispered to me later that Dorothy had miraculously recovered the moment she thought no one was watching. Standing my ground against their demands was the hardest thing I'd ever done, harder than surviving the surgeries or learning to walk again. These people had programmed me from birth to seek their approval, to believe I owed them everything for the accident of being born. But as I sat in my wheelchair, surrounded by chosen family, who'd shown more love in months than my parents had in decades, I finally understood the truth. I didn't owe them $66,000. I didn't owe them anything at all. They'd already taken more than any parent had a right to claim. They'd taken my childhood, my self-worth, and nearly my life. The settlement money wasn't theirs to claim. It was compensation for pain they'd multiplied for a life they'd tried to cash in. And I was done being their investment property. David Chen turned out to be more than just a lawyer. He was an avenging angel with a law degree and a particular hatred for parental financial abuse. Within 2 weeks of taking my case, he'd assembled a team of forensic accountants who began unraveling the twisted web of my parents' financial crimes. What they found would have been impressive if it weren't so personally devastating. The tax fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. My parents had been claiming me as a dependent while simultaneously billing me for expenses, a double-dipping scheme that had netted them nearly $400,000 in fraudulent deductions over 15 years. They'd also claimed educational credits for Blake's multiple college attempts. While I'd been filing my own taxes and paying my own tuition, the IRS did not look kindly on such creative accounting. The real estate empire my parents had built was constructed on a foundation of exploitation and borderline fraud. David's investigators found 17 former business partners who'd been cheated, manipulated, or outright robbed. My parents had a pattern of targeting vulnerable people, usually elderly property owners or those in financial distress, convincing them to sign partnerships that inevitably ended with Dorothy and Richard owning everything. Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow, had lost her family home of 40 years to one of their schemes. Jorge Martinez had his construction company destroyed after trusting them with a joint venture. Each story was eerily similar to my own experience. My parents would identify a target, feign care and concern, then systematically strip them of assets while playing the victim if challenged. I wasn't their daughter. I was just their longest-running mark. Blake's involvement ran deeper than anyone suspected. He wasn't just the spoiled golden child. He was an active participant in their crimes. Bank records showed he'd been funneling money through shell companies, helping hide assets, and enable tax evasion. His failed businesses weren't failures at all, but money laundering operations that cleaned their dirty real estate profits. The FBI would later determine he'd moved over $2 million through cryptocurrency schemes designed to look like startup failures. I made the hardest decision of my life on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sitting in David's office, surrounded by evidence of my family's crimes, I gave him permission to report everything to the authorities. "They're still your parents," he reminded me gently, giving me one last chance to protect them. But I thought of Carla holding my hand in the hospital, of Monica, fighting for my life, of strangers who donated to save me, while my parents calculated my insurance value. "No," I said firmly. "Parents don't try to profit from their children's death. They're just criminals who happen to share my DNA." The IRS Criminal Division moved fast once they saw David's evidence. Federal agents raided my parents' home and offices on a Thursday morning, seizing computers, documents, and decades of fraudulent records. Dorothy called me from the back of a federal vehicle, screaming that I'd destroyed the family. I hung up and blocked the number. Some bridges weren't worth maintaining. They needed to be burned to ash. Going public was David's idea. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, he said, connecting me with a journalist who'd been investigating financial crimes against family members. My story, backed by documents and recordings, became part of a larger expose on parental financial abuse. The hashtag toxic parents began trending as hundreds of people shared similar experiences of family members who saw them as ATMs rather than children. The local news picked up the story with enthusiasm. The same reporters who'd covered my medical crisis were fascinated by this new chapter. They ran segments showing my parents' mansion juxtaposed with my hospital bills, their luxury cars parked outside the federal courthouse. Dorothy's charity connections evaporated overnight as organizations distanced themselves from the scandal. Her position on the hospital board, the same hospital that had saved my life despite her indifference, was revoked within days. Richard's country club membership became untenable as fellow members learned about his schemes. Several were former business partners who'd suspected fraud but never had proof. The exclusive golf club that had been his pride and joy voted to expel him, a social death that hurt him more than any criminal charge. Blake was banned too, though he was already too busy with his own legal problems to care about golf. The attempted break-in at my apartment was Blake's desperate attempt to steal evidence. He was so panicked by the federal investigation that he tried to break in while I was home, not realizing I'd installed security cameras after their last visit. The footage of him trying to jimmy my window while muttering about finding the files was almost comedic. His arrest for attempted burglary and assault after he'd pushed my friend Sarah when she tried to stop him added to their mounting legal troubles. The restraining order hearing became a public spectacle. My parents showed up with their dwindling resources, hiring a budget attorney who was clearly out of his depth. They tried to paint me as a vindictive daughter persecuting innocent parents, but David had prepared meticulously. He presented evidence of harassment, financial fraud, and the life insurance policy they'd hoped to collect. The judge not only granted the restraining order, but referred the case to the district attorney for additional criminal charges. The real victory came when their assets were frozen. The IRS moved to secure property and accounts to ensure payment of back taxes and penalties. My parents, who'd lived like royalty on stolen money and fraudulent tax returns, suddenly couldn't access their funds. Dorothy was caught trying to sell jewelry at a pawn shop, a fall from grace that made the society pages she'd once graced. Blake's arrest made headlines when he attacked one of my supporters outside the courthouse. In full view of news cameras, he punched my coworker Janet, who'd organized the original GoFundMe. His mugshot, featuring a black eye courtesy of Janet's self-defense training, became a meme representing entitled criminals who couldn't handle consequences. The assault charges, combined with his financial crimes, guaranteed significant jail time. My parents' final desperate move was asking me to help with their legal fees. Through their attorney, they requested a meeting to discuss family reconciliation. I agreed, curious to see how low they'd sink. In a sterile conference room, my once proud parents looked diminished. Dorothy's designer clothes were gone, replaced by discount store outfits. Richard's hands shook as he tried to maintain his authoritative voice. "Regina," Dorothy began, trying her old manipulation tactics. "Whatever our differences, we're still family. Surely you don't want to see your parents in prison." I almost laughed at the irony. The woman who'd calculated my worth in insurance money was now appealing to family bonds she'd never honored. Richard added his plea, talking about forgiveness and second chances, concepts they'd never extended to me. Blake wasn't there. He was already in custody, unable to make bail after the judge deemed him a flight risk. My golden child brother, the one who'd received every advantage while I scraped for crumbs, was wearing orange and sharing a cell with actual criminals who weren't impressed by his sob stories. The universe had a sense of justice after all. I looked at my parents, these strangers who'd given me life but tried to steal it back for profit, and felt nothing. No anger, no hatred, just empty space where love should have lived. You had 34 years to be parents, I said quietly. You chose to be predators instead. I survived despite you, not because of you, and I owe you exactly what you gave me when I was dying. Nothing. The meeting ended with Dorothy's tears and Richard's threats, a final performance of the roles they'd played my entire life. As I wheeled myself out, leaving them to face the consequences of their choices, I felt lighter than I had since childhood. My chosen family was waiting in the lobby. Janet, Sarah, Michael, Monica from the hospital. Even Carla, who'd held my hand through the worst night of my life. These people who owed me nothing had given me everything, while those who owed me love had tried to sell it back to me. The investigation would continue for months, uncovering more victims and more crimes. My parents would eventually plead guilty to numerous charges, trading their mansion for matching prison cells. Blake would serve 5 years, missing the best years of his life, just as he'd missed every opportunity to be a decent human being. But that was their story now, not mine. I had a different ending to write. 6 months after the federal raid, I sat in a packed courtroom as my parents were sentenced for tax fraud, money laundering, and various financial crimes. Dorothy, who'd once swept into charity galas and designer gowns, now stood in a plain gray suit provided by the court. Richard's hands were cuffed in front of him, the power he'd wielded over our family reduced to metal restraints. They each received 8 years in federal prison, though they'd likely serve 5 with good behavior. Blake had already been sentenced 3 months earlier. His assault charges combined with the financial crimes earned him a 5-year sentence in state prison. The golden child, who'd never faced a consequence in his life, was now learning hard lessons about reality. I heard through the legal grapevine that he'd tried to run his usual manipulation games on fellow inmates. It hadn't gone well. I used part of my settlement to establish proper trauma therapy with Dr. Elena Martinez, a specialist in family betrayal and complex PTSD. Those sessions, twice a week for months, helped me understand that my parents' behavior wasn't my fault. I hadn't failed to be lovable enough. They'd failed to be human enough. The little girl who'd spent decades chasing their approval finally learned she'd been running after shadows. The remainder of the settlement went towards something meaningful. I established Carla's Fund, named after the nurse who'd shown me what real compassion looked like. The nonprofit provided emergency medical funding for people caught in insurance gaps, just as I'd been. Monica from the hospital helped set it up, bringing her expertise in navigating healthcare bureaucracy. Janet joined our board along with several others who'd witnessed my story firsthand. In our first year, Carla's fund helped 43 families avoid the choice between bankruptcy and death. Each case reminded me why I'd survived, why strangers had rallied to save me when family wouldn't. We covered everything from emergency surgeries to cancer treatments, always with the same philosophy: no one should die because they can't afford to live. The fund's first major event was a gala dinner that raised over $200,000. I stood at the podium, no longer in a wheelchair, but still bearing the scars of survival, and told my story to 300 donors. In the audience was Carla herself, retired now, but still volunteering at the hospital. When I introduced her as our inspiration, the standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. She cried, I cried, everyone cried. But these were tears of joy, not the bitter salt I'd shed in that hospital bed. That's where I met James. He was attending as a representative of his company's charitable foundation, but we ended up talking for hours about everything except fundraising. He'd grown up with narcissistic parents too, understanding the unique grief of mourning living parents who never truly existed. Our first real date was at a bookstore cafe, where we spent 6 hours sharing stories and realizing we'd found someone who truly understood. My chosen family grew stronger with each passing month. Sarah and Michael became my rocks, the siblings I'd never had. Monica turned from professional advocate to genuine friend, our weekly dinners a bright spot in my schedule. Even Dr. Patterson, the surgeon who'd saved my life, stayed in touch, occasionally referring patients who needed Carla's fund. These relationships, built on genuine care rather than obligation or manipulation, showed me what family really meant. The promotion to regional sales director came with a generous raise and the option to work remotely. I bought a small house in Glastonbury with a home office overlooking a garden I planted myself. Each plant represented growth, from darkness life, from near death. The roses were especially meaningful, beautiful, but protected by thorns like I'd learned to be. My parents had taught me that lesson, though not the way they'd intended. Speaking engagements became a regular part of my life. I traveled to conferences and support groups, sharing my story with others trapped in toxic family dynamics. The message was always the same: you don't owe anyone access to your life just because they gave it to you. Blood relation is not a blank check for abuse. Family is chosen by love, not assigned by DNA. The book deal came through a literary agent who'd heard me speak at a survivors conference. Breaking the Cycle When Family Becomes Financial Fraud would be published the following year. Writing it was therapeutic, each chapter another step away from the guilt and toward genuine freedom. The advance went directly to Carla's fund, funding 10 more families' medical emergencies. My parents sent a letter through their attorney 6 months into their sentence. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, apologizing without accepting responsibility, asking for forgiveness while implying I owed it to them. They wanted me to visit, to reconcile, to pretend the past could be erased with pretty words. I responded with a single paragraph setting clear boundaries. I would not visit. I would not send money. I would not pretend they were parents when they'd only ever been parasites. But I wish them well in learning to be better humans, even if I wouldn't be around to see it. Blake never wrote. I heard he was having a hard time in prison, his charm and manipulation useless against people who'd seen real hardship. Part of me pitied him, the golden child who'd never learned to stand on his own feet. But mostly, I felt relief that he could no longer hurt anyone while locked away. Maybe prison would teach him what our parents never had, that other people matter. The charity gala became an annual event. The second year, we raised $500,000 and expanded services to 3 states. I stood at the podium again, this time with James by my side, and looked out at a room full of people who understood that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up. It's about holding someone's hand when they're scared. It's about fighting for strangers because it's the right thing to do. During my speech, I noticed 2 figures standing in the shadows by the service entrance. Even from a distance, I recognized the way they held themselves, diminished, but still defiant. My parents, out on early release for good behavior, had come to see what their daughter had built from the ashes of their cruelty. Security moved to escort them out, but I shook my head. Let them see. Let them witness what love and support could create, everything their greed had tried to destroy. They left before the speech ended, slipping away like the shadows they'd always been in my life when I truly needed them. I continued speaking, sharing how Carla's fund had just saved its 100th life. The applause was thunderous, but what mattered more were the tears on faces of families we'd helped. These people knew what it meant to be saved by strangers to discover family in unexpected places. Later that night, as James and I walked through the garden I'd planted, I thought about everything that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the near death experiences, all of it had led to something beautiful. Not because suffering was noble, but because I'd chosen to transform it into purpose. My parents had given me life, then tried to cash it in. But in the end, I'd learned its true value from a nurse named Carla who held my hand in the darkness. Family isn't about blood or obligation, I said to James as we stood among the roses. It's about those who show up when you're bleeding on a hospital gurney with $25,000 between you and death. My parents gave me life, but they taught me its true value only when they tried to put a price tag on it. Some lessons are worth more than $66,000. They're priceless. The stars were bright overhead, and somewhere in the distance, another family was getting the call that Carla's fund could help. Another life saved, another chain of toxic obligation broken. My parents had refused to pay for my surgery, seeing only the cost and not the value. Now, through their greed and cruelty, hundreds of lives would be saved. It was a return on investment they'd never calculated, a profit that couldn't be measured in dollars. I thought of Regina at 34 dying alone while her parents counted their money. She'd survived to become someone who ensured no one else would face that isolation. The scars remained both physical and emotional, but they were proof of survival, not surrender. My parents had tried to bill me for being born. Instead, I'd learned that some things like chosen family, genuine love, and the hand that holds yours in the darkness are beyond price. They're simply priceless, and that's the greatest lesson toxic parents never mean to teach. Have you ever dealt with family members who saw you as an investment rather than a person? What would you do if your parents presented you with a bill for raising you? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of survival and triumph over toxic family dynamics. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in dealing with family financial abuse. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, you don't owe anyone access to your life just because they share your DNA. Stay strong, choose your real family wisely, and never let anyone put a price tag on your worth.